Did you know that backup tape is experiencing a resurgence in demand? And it's for a reason I never even contemplated when I was using it in the data center over 30 years ago. On last week's episode, I talked about how I created a real air gap back then using tape and Iron Mountain. This is a gap that even the best ransomware cannot penetrate, and that's why tape is getting a second win. In this episode, we talked to two experts from IBM and Fujifilm who are sponsoring this episode, and they help us understand what makes tape so special. It's fast, immutable, holds data reliably far longer than disk can, and it costs less. I've been a fan of tape since I cut my teeth on it in the early 90s, and I'm excited to hear this news. I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and this podcast turns unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Hi, and welcome to the Backup Wrap-Up. I'm your host, W. Curtis Preston, and I have with me the guy that should have told me that I hadn't pressed record last time, Prasanna Malaviya. Prasanna.
I know. It seems like this is like our first podcast episode, that we don't know anything.
Yeah. Luckily, we record the news separate from the main part of the podcast. Luckily, it was just a news segment. So we talked for about 10 minutes and then I went to end the recording and I'm like, Prasanna?
Well, the funny thing is I was like, I wonder how long this episode is. And I tried finding because there's normally an elapsed time that it shows. And I was like, that's interesting. Yeah. I don't see it. Maybe they changed the UI. You know how these SaaS products are. They're always changing things around.
Yeah, they are indeed. It is time for the news of the week. So our first story, interesting headline, Backblaze blitzes cloud storage speeds with shard stash cache.
That's a mouthful. What does it mean, Curtis?
First off, you have to talk about Backblaze. Backblaze is both a backup vendor and a storage vendor. They have a product that competes with AWS S3. And this is specifically talking about that product. They call it B2. They write the incoming data to hard drives, but at the same time, they're also writing it to SSDs. And because the way they're uploading the data is a piece at a time, a common term that we use in that world is shard for that piece of data. And so they're calling it a shard stash, otherwise known as a cache. And they're comparing it and saying that it's significantly faster than uploading to S3 as a result.
What they're doing is writing in parallel to both the SSD and the hard drive. Once it hits the SSD, then they could reply back to the client, which helps with latency, which is where you see a lot of the performance improvements. Yeah. And especially when you start to talk about small files, this is where it makes a significant improvement in performance. I think they quoted sort of 30% better latency than normal S3 because they're able to accept the write immediately and then acknowledge the client, which will then send the next piece versus having to wait for it to commit to hard drives, which might take a little bit of time. Remember, it's not just writing to one hard drive. They're writing across multiple hard drives, across multiple systems for redundancy purposes. So to make sure everything's okay, they need to wait for all those commits to come back, which takes time. I think they say it needs to hit 19 out of 20 hard disks. And so that could take time versus writing to SSD, acknowledging. And then once it does make it to hard drive, then you can remove it from the SSD because it has been persisted in its final location.
It just seems odd to write it to both places at the same time rather than to just write through one to the other. But that is what they're doing. And any other advantages that you can think of for doing this?
Remember, backup data sets are typically a bunch of small file writes, right? You're not going to be sending a single 10 gig file, right? Even though you might be sending it in smaller chunks. And so this is where it could help with the performance.
Yeah, they did a test specifically with Veeam Backup, and they backed up a terabyte of VMs with 256K block sizes. They're saying with S3, it took 3 hours and 12 minutes. With B2, it took 2 hours and 15 minutes. So that's 40% faster.
Yeah, our second story is about Cohesity. So they have introduced a new integration that allows Cohesity smart files to become Snowflake Analytics Playground. And so, really, what it is Snowflake, you have a bunch of data that has been stored there. It could be backup data, but Cohesity give you secondary NAS capabilities where you can now just export a mount point and store your data there. And now with this integration, what it allows is instead of having to copy the data out and into Snowflake in order to be able to process and do that and move the data out, they now allow Snowflake to run their analytics against the data that's already stored in Cohesity. So saving you that copy operation, the movement operation, and allows you to run it locally.
I don't know a ton about Snowflake, but basically it sounds like they're allowing full support for Snowflake within their world, which what it does is it increases the perceived value of that product within a particular environment if that customer is a Snowflake user.
So the other thing is that it's not just Cohesity running on premises, but if you have a Cohesity instance that's running smart files in the cloud, you can also connect directly to that as well. And if you have Snowflake running in the cloud, you could pull the data from there or access the data from there directly.
Well, that's the news of the week. This episode is sponsored by IBM and Fujifilm. Our first guest works for Fujifilm Recording Media USA and has been in marketing of tape storage for some 30 years now. Rich writes a blog called Fujifilm Insights that can be found at fujifilmusa.com. Welcome to the podcast, Rich Gadomski.
Hey, thanks very much, Curtis. Prasanna, great to be here again. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. Our next guest is a tape evangelist who's been ensuring the preservation of the world's digital history. Welcome to the podcast, Sean Brumet.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here.
Well, we're glad to have both of you. This is actually our first official sponsored episode, so we're very excited to have two friends of the pod on. How are things in the tape world these days?
Sean, take it away.
Well, tape is having really a great big resurgence in the technology market. And we say resurgence, it's never really gone away. It's moved into the enterprise. But more and more people are looking at things like cyber resiliency and saying, how do I protect data? How do I really air gap it? And tape is fundamentally at its core air gap cyber resilient.
Yeah, Prasanna, you remember, I think it was just last week, wasn't it, that we recorded an episode where we talked about basically what I'm now calling old school air gap or actual air gap.
Yeah, I remember that versus a virtual air gap or...
Yeah, exactly. Because everybody's using the term air gap now. And we recorded this episode where we basically said, this is about cybersecurity. I remember back in the day, we weren't really thinking so much about cybersecurity. We were just thinking, let's get a copy of these backups far away from the thing that we're backing up, right? Let's put it in a box, hand it to a man in a van, and then it would show up somewhere else and then magically reappear back in a few weeks, and then we could recycle those tapes. We were mainly thinking about, getting a gap of air in order to protect it from a fire or a flood or something like that. But nowadays, it sounds like one of the primary reasons people are thinking about tape has to do with cybersecurity. Rich, does that seem about what you're saying?
To your point, tape was always great for DR applications, backup, DR, obviously archive. And I think the reason for that is because it is so portable, easily removable from its environment. So you can safely get it offline, off-site. And that's really critical today. More so, as you mentioned, it's not just about, hurricanes and fires and floods, earthquakes. It really today, the threat is cyber related. So anything that's connected to the network, in our opinion, and I think most experts would agree, if it's connected to the network, hackers can figure out how to access it. And so when it comes to data storage, getting at least mission critical data offline, offsite, is a best practice that a lot of the federal government agencies are advocating for today. When you look at the FBI, CISA, Department of Homeland Security, even to a certain extent, Securities and Exchange Commission. It's interesting, what they're talking about now, and we can get more into that. But definitely, tape, was always removable, always portable. It's gotten better today because of its, incredible capacity increase. So just to give you a quick example, if you go back 10 years ago with LTO6, to get 1 petabyte off site would take 160 tapes, 160 cartridges. Okay. It was only 2.5 terabytes compressed, 6.25. That's how you get the 160. Well, today with LTO9, you're talking about 23 tapes. You're talking about a case of tapes to put a petabyte offsite, offline. So it makes a lot of sense today. And of course, it's very, very cost effective.
So I know we talked about sort of the air gap, Curtis, and I know on our last episode we talked, and Rich, you just mentioned sort of you could take tape and you can move it offline, which is great. Take it out, move it off site. I think one thing though, Curtis, that came up in our conversation last week, which I hadn't really thought about, is the process aspect, right? Part of it is keeping your data offline, but the other thing is being able to build a completely separate process to ensure that hackers could not get to your data even if they tried to. So I know the example you gave, Curtis, was Iron Mountain having a separate call-in, right? Having sort of a mechanism to allow for data to only come back to be restored or deleted, which is a separate exception process that needs to be verified by multiple people. All these things which get a little bit more difficult from a virtual air gap solution perspective versus a physical tape where you have the flexibility because it's offline, right? I can just move those 23 tapes like you were mentioning, Rich, right? I can just move it from one location to another location fairly easily, but trying to move all that data physically over a network would probably be impossible, plus the controls you need in place from a process perspective.
Never underestimate the bandwidth of a truck.
That's right.
Yes.
Truck nets.
Yes.
You bring that up. That is such a great point. That is, I think that's where Rich was going, was that the scale of data today, if you start looking at AI applications and IoTs, they're pulling together all this data and it needs to be protected. Well, how do they, one, fundamentally protect it air gap wise? What's the process? But number two, how do you meet the scale? Because as you said, can you imagine taking a petabyte every night and just pushing it over the wire, right? Just to protect it, not to create transaction or anything else, but just to preserve that data. The other point that comes behind that is, how do you establish a second site easily and effectively if you've got it coming in to a single site? If IoT is collecting from the edge and coming into the data center, how do you propagate it? And tape is being used as that air gap orchestration to say, hey, move the data, stream it in. And what a lot of people don't realize is there's always talk of, well, tape's slow, right? Well,
you won't hear that here.
fundamentally-
Trust me, Sean, you won't hear that
You won't
from this
hear that
podcast.
Fundamentally, it's linearly extremely high performance, right? And those that deal with it. Now, if you're going to go get little segments, sure. So if you're going to stream that data in, there's nothing that can stream like tape as far as efficiency, and then move the truck net. Take the truck net and move that whole, and we talk a petabyte today, but a petabyte's a start. I mean, usually people are talking about, well, I ingest, 100 petabytes a year, and I need to move 10% or 15% of that data on a regular basis. So we've seen a lot of orchestration around not only the air gap protection, which is multi-layered, but also how do I reestablish a site? How do I make it easier to move all that data? And tape's great because for portability, it's safe to port your data with it.
Right. There are a number of workflows that involve transporting a lot of data on a very regular basis, and those workflows are very tape friendly, right? I certainly think I live in Southern California. Right up the road, there's a whole bunch of people who make a whole lot of stuff on a very regular basis, and that stuff needs to be transported around. Tape is very popular when I go to National Association of Broadcasters, right, at the NAB show. Tape is very popular at NAB. Sean, you mentioned about the concern. It's so funny when I'm talking to just random people that aren't deep within the backup world. I say, I'm going to ask you a fill in the blank question, and and I want them to fill in the blank. And I say, the reason that a lot of the backup world moved, from tape to disk, was it because tape was too blank, right? And everyone always says slow, right? They're like, oh, the tape was too slow. It's like, no, that was not the problem. The problem was we couldn't match the speed of the tape, right? So the tape is actually really, really fast. The problem that we have is like with incremental backups and trying to, make the tape drive happy. That's the challenge that became the new challenge. But all of those great things about tape, the cost effectiveness, and it's not even close, right? I've done a number of cost comparisons when I look at tape versus disk, even disk with deduplication, that even if the disk were free, like even if you bought the disk array for $1, that the power and cooling to operate that disk array would be more than the cost of an entire tape-based system that you purchased and operated, right? So it's not even close from a cost perspective. And then let's also talk a little bit about, again, you're with Friends of Tape here, right? We talk a lot about the bit error rate of tape versus disk and competing technologies. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Who wants to talk about that, Rich or Sean?
Well, let me hit the TCO point, and I'll turn over to bit error rate if you want, Rich, to you, or I can handle that as well.
Sure.
But a little bit about TCO, I totally agree with you. When you talk about the total cost of ownership, you have to put everything in there. You can't just say, well, I found an HDD at Costco that's only $62, right? Okay, great, but there's a lot that goes along with that. And one of the things that gets thrown out is the fact that there's a carbon impact to that. Right? When you start talking about maintaining that data and spending that energy, there's a serious carbon impact. So we totally agree. And I don't run into too many people anymore that say, well, I can do HDD for the same cost, unless they have a very small amount of data, right? They're pretty open. And Rich, do you want to do bit error rate, or you want me to throw in a couple of things on that?
Yeah, I'll just keep it real simple. With the latest generation of LTO, say LTO9 and the TS1170, the IBM 3592 product, the bit error rate is expressed as 1 times 10 to the 20th power. So that's several orders of magnitude better than what you have with HDD and flash, which is typically 1 times 10 to the 15, 16, or 17th power.
So what does that mean in terms of, like, for our listeners, right? If I had X amount of data, I would expect 1 bit to be flipped how often? Like, or based on how much data?
So that's like 1 bit in every 100 petabytes.
Okay.
Versus 1 bit in every 100 terabytes, I think, or 100 terabytes. If it's 3 orders of magnitude different,
right?
Then that would be, and that sounds like that's the best, right? Because if it's 20 versus 17, then if it's 1 petabyte, then it's 100 terabytes.
100 terabytes.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is significant.
Which means that you have a bit that is flipped, that is a 1 instead of a 0, and you don't know it, right? That's just it's the dirty little secret of magnetic recording.
Well,
not just magnetic recording, all recording, right?
Right, and that's it's the in the fundamentals, HDD works to counter that with ECC rates. And if you were to convert that, like everybody says, well, 100 petabytes, what does it really mean in tapes? It means that you would run around the Earth 1.5 times almost before you'd hit that bit error rate statistically in tape, around the center of the Earth. So that is a lot of tape processing before you get there.
Yeah, and we've seen it in practical applications. CERN had a great story where they did a migration. I think it was from maybe it was TS1150 to TS1155. And they transferred 100 petabytes of data from the lower capacity cartridge to the higher capacity cartridge. And at the end of that process, they had, I think, 3 or 4 gigabytes that they couldn't recover, but sent those cartridges to IBM, who did recover them. So out of 100 petabytes, they had no data loss. So, practically speaking, you don't often see 100 petabyte migration, but it's a great opportunity to really test, the integrity of the system.
Yeah, and the other thing that I throw out, if somebody is truly concerned about that, they can literally make another copy for for next to nothing, right? That's something you can do in tape, because what a lot of people don't think about tape versus disc is that with disc, the mechanics and the media they're inseparable, right? Everything's all inside. Whereas with tape, the mechanics and the media are two separate things. So the media has a separate cost element, and so you can have a whole separate copy on tape for much less price than, like, you can't even compare that, right? And so if you did have 1 bit error rate on a crucial piece of data, if you had a second copy, you wouldn't have that bit in the same spot, right? So let me ask you a question. So let's say somebody has, they got on the dedupe and disk bandwagon 20 years ago, or they're like somebody like Prasanna, who's never seen a tape in the wild.
I've seen a tape. I've never had to use it.
Or, somebody who maybe, they cut their teeth on LTO1, right? And, and they remember the days of like lost leader things and all that, those bad days. What can they look forward to as what's happened to tape in the last 10 to 20 years, advancements?
Yeah. Well, I'll start, Sean. I mean, the big thing is capacity. And I alluded to it earlier, comparing, say, LTO6 to LTO9 today. But just recently, IBM and Fujifilm announced a new 50 terabyte tape cartridge, which is 2.5 times the previous generation of the TS1160 3592JE cartridge. So, I mean, if you look at the compound annual growth rate of capacity growth over the last 10 years, the previous 50 years pales in comparison. So a lot of the technological advancements have been happening in the last 10 to 20 years, more so than in the earlier days. So the technological advancements are very rapid these days. Capacity is an excellent example. Of course, the cartridge mechanics, the durability, drives and media have been greatly enhanced. So it's a technology that's not sitting still. It's not collecting rust. It's
right.
not. Some people say it's not your father's Oldsmobile, and that couldn't be more true. But look, we did a 580 terabyte demonstration with the IBM lab out of Zurich. 580 terabytes. That's native capacity on a LTO size cartridge. And in fact, the LTO roadmap has now been extended to LTO 14, which gets very close to that capacity, 576 terabytes native. So you're over 1.4 petabytes with compression. So the tech, and do we need that kind of capacity? They're talking about the need to protect and preserve up to 26 zettabytes of persistent data by the end of this decade. So just 1 zettabyte is 55 million 18 terabyte hard drives. 55 million 18 terabyte hard drives. One LTO9, 1 zettabyte is 55 million LTO9 cartridges at native capacity. So what's, the big picture is data growth is truly with rampant. It is exponential is the word I was looking for, and the value of data is increasing by leaps and bounds now that we can apply artificial intelligence to it, analytics. So what does that mean? People want to keep that data now for longer periods of time. How do you do that cost effectively? And you've got a tried and true technology with an incredible ecosystem behind it. We recently put out our Tape Storage Council report. There were 25 member companies listed, and that's probably half of the people, that could be on that report. So there's a tremendous ecosystem. The leaps and bounds of automation, I should let Sean speak about that. But the technology is not sitting still.
Rich, you talked about how much physically resilient tape has become, and especially LTO tape. So funny little story. I made a music video and we were parodying Adele's Rolling in the Deep. And one shot in Rolling in the Deep, she's smashing dishes against the wall. And so I wanted to smash LTO tapes against the wall and have them like explode. And no matter how hard we hit them against the wall, they wouldn't shatter into multiple pieces. So the only way we were able to get it to work was to physically disassemble them, take out all the screws, and then tape them back together with Scotch tape, so that when we would throw them at the wall, they would fly apart. Anyway, I just thought you would find that amusing.
Yeah, that's very funny. But what we find is the durability of the cartridges far exceed the actual usage typically. There's very few environments around the world that really exceed any of the specifications. That really durability is excellent. We measure defective parts per million. It's just almost negligible, almost zero. But Sean, talk about encryption.
Yeah, I think encryption goes into what's been happening with tape over the last 20 years. Believe it or not, from a hardware point of view in storage, tape really led the industry into that in 2005-6 timeframe, introducing AES 256, really kicking it up with key management because key lifecycle management was so important. It's embedded in the drive with a certificate in the drive to support synchronous and asynchronous encryption. And the encryption itself is AES 256 up till today, which is still quantum safe as far as Grover's algorithm goes. And the latest tape drive, TS1170, is prepped for when NIST finally ratifies the latest. Yeah, and I see everybody's, we're laughing a little bit, but when NIST finally ratifies the latest algorithms, we're ready to put those certificates in there and get it fully quantum secure. But on top of that, we've done a lot of stuff in the tape drive that people don't readily grasp onto as a very innovative technology. And coming from the backup wrap-up, this is really important. We were talking about incremental backups and these little chunks of files or data that are out there. Back in, circa call it 2005, 2006, we started a program inside the drive that does what we call backhitchless flush. And essentially it says, hey, if you come to me and you've got a bunch of files you're reading in order and you read the stop of the file, rather than backing up and starting the new file and then just, this real slow process, we're just going to process it. So inside the processor of the tape drive, we just stream down and meet the effectiveness of the tape drive. And then we said, well, let's make it one better. And we introduced in 2015 the ability to say, hey, I'm going to pull back these 1,000 files or assets or data chunks. And they're all over this tape. You drive, tell me the order I need to go get them in. And then tell me that's what you're going to do, and I'll tell you go get them. And it is proven to reduce the cycle time between 60 and 83% at the max, depending on, what your distance, etc. is, which goes back to, is tape being innovative? Every single day it's driving into that. So we're again leading encryption. Some of the individuals who do encryption in the tape drive are the individuals who have led the latest NIST push. As you may or may not know, IBM's introduced its algorithms, and they're still part of the last round. I guess they're going into round 4 now at NIST to get those algorithms approved. So tape is really heavily engaged, and we tell people, don't put your data on a tape or anything for that matter at rest without encryption. There's no reason. There's no penalty, literally no penalty for using encryption, except for no one can ever access your data illegally.
Yeah. Like you said, Sean, it's like, yeah, you better make sure you have encryption turned on because, like you said, those might leave your physical presence. Those are easy to find, right? Things happen. You want to make sure that your data is safe, and being able to offload that encryption to the tape drive itself to ensure every single piece of data gets encrypted, regardless of what the client is that's writing to the tape, I think ensures standardization across the board rather than ensuring that an admin did not or did check the box that said enable an encryption right at the backup software level, which we know mistakes always happen, right? People get busy. They're not able to always find the right checkboxes and settings. So having that on by default makes a lot of sense. I was going to ask you a question though, Sean. I know you're talking about the technology to sort of put things in order, right? The drive puts the files in order that need to be read back. Before I started on this podcast and talking to Curtis and learning from the experts like yourselves about tape, I would always think that tape was typically used for sort of full restore cases, right? Hey, I had a site blow up. I need to recover this entire application, or I have a table that got dropped. I need to go back 3 weeks and restore the entire database. But are you starting to see it more and more common, especially in cyber instances where it is really more of that file level restore capabilities or a subset of backups that need to come back from tape?
In the cyber world, we see that it's actually more of a stream the whole thing out because they're trying to figure out what's happened to their data and they want to get it back. But they're going to selectively choose it. What we are seeing is an enormous growth in active/archive use. In other words, I have these files and they're active and then they move semi-active and I need 2 copies anyways. I'm just going to make my primary data, back it all up, push it right to tape.
Yeah.
And I've got a second copy on there. And then when I say, hey, look, it's not being touched anymore, I'm going to get rid of it. In that instance, all of a sudden what happens is all these requests, because no matter how we would like to say we're never going to look at our PowerPoints from 5 years ago, somebody's going to come back and say, I did a great PowerPoint 5 years ago and I want that back. And they'll now start pulling those forward. But it's also being used in the application of, I need 2 or 3 copies because it's my service business to provide protection of data. And they are just massive multi-tenancy environments to go get this data. So they're not being requested by one organization. They're being requested by 100 or 1,000 organizations. And that leads to the need for random access ordering. That's what we call it in the tape, which comes back and says, oh yeah, we've got 1,200 requests and we're going to cut the time to get them back by 83%. Go, go, go. Yep. So we are seeing a big shift from cyber's, as you guys know, 3, 2, 1, and 1 is now 3, 2, 1, and 1 with a 0 because nothing can be lost. And we're seeing more and more of that application coming into the active archive realm, where clients need their data, they need multiple copies, and it comes right back to sustainability and cost. How much do I want to pay for the second and third copies? Because if the first one truly goes away, I probably have a bigger problem.
Yeah.
And a little bit of time to get to that data is okay.
It's okay, exactly. At least I have access to it rather than it's gone completely.
That's right. Exactly.
Sean, you talked a little bit about the active archive thing, and so one of the things that I thought also we could talk, this active archive idea, I know is another area where tape is doing really well. Again, for that person, I'll just say again, if we take the average, IT person on the street, um, the idea of tape as a place to put data for a very long period of time seems really weird. They're thinking, oh, hard disk. I like hard, right? Or solid state. That sounds really solid. So what I'm curious about, Rich here, is I'd love to hear about and of course, I already know the answers to this to this question that I'm asking. But Rich, like, what have we done with the media itself in the past, however many years?
With most recent 50 terabyte cartridge from IBM, we're using a new substrate called aramid, which is thinner and much stronger. We actually are using a mix of barium ferrite, which is kind of the current de facto standard, with next gen strontium ferrite magnetic particle. But I want to just say thanks for mentioning Active Archive, Sean. That's close to my heart. It's a great application for it. Really, archive has become a 4-letter word. I know this is a backup cybersecurity, but the nice thing about an active archive environment is you can easily export, a copy of the tapes for cybersecurity air gap purposes. But nobody wants to archive. People want 24/7 access to their data. So an active archive allows you to do that cost effectively. And it is infrequently accessed data, so you don't want to keep it on spinning disk or on solid state, which are, by the way, great technologies. We need a ton of solid state. We need a ton of disk. We need a ton of tape too, because that's what it's going to take to really properly protect data and preserve it long term. But the other thing Sean said was sustainability. Sustainability has become a huge issue, and it transcends every application throughout the entire organization, including cybersecurity and data protection. So, tape consumes 87% less energy than disk. Studies show that it produces 97% less CO2e. And, we were joking at the beginning of the show prior to recording that, here I am bundled up because it's freezing cold in New Jersey, but at the end of this week, it's going to be 80 degrees. So it's hard to deny climate change, global warming. I mean, we see evidence of it every single day. And Sean can speak to this. Every single RFQ he gets today for storage, they want to know what is the sustainability impact. I'll let Sean talk to that.
Yeah, if I could add to Rich's to relate for the listener, what you're talking about strontium ferrite, it's an aramid, and what does that really mean? The benefits long term of substrates like aramid are, think about a giant sailboat sail, the main sail that really pulls a lot of drag. Aramid is used in those strands of aramid because they're strong, they're water resistant, they're sun resistant, and that's what's being used in that tape to preserve the longevity of data. So from a relatable point of view, aramid and these other technologies in tape is very advanced. We just don't talk about them because they're kind of under the covers. It's like, so you're putting sailboat sails in your tape. I really don't care. I just want my data to be there, right? So.
Yeah, I think the reason why I wanted to mention it, just sort of the overall, when we talk about tape versus disk, especially when we talk about long-term storage, right? That the thing that people, I think the average person doesn't understand is just how much cheaper tape is, just how much better it is at writing ones and zeros than any other medium. And then also, really importantly, is how good it is at holding on to those ones and zeros for a really long period of time without any power applied to it, right? And so some of those advancements came from those substrate changes, right? To the change to barium ferrite was a big one. That also, as I recall, that had a big capacity change because you could do different things with the bits and put them closer together. And what's really sort of funny to me is as we've done changes over the years with tape, and the bits have gotten closer and closer together on the media, they're nowhere near. It's like a astronomical difference between how close they are together on disk, which is why there's such a big difference as to how well it can hold on to those ones and zeros. But anyway, I preach. Sorry.
But it is a good point. But it is a good point, though, because I think a lot of people do get confused and they do think, hey, I can use an SSD for my backup or for my archives, right? And it's like, please don't do, I know everyone's face, right?
Please don't do that.
Yeah, but some people do that, right? They're like, hey, let me just use this because it's cheap, it's reasonable, it has high performance, but they don't understand that durability aspect.
Yeah, or the cost or the energy involved in that. Yeah.
Yeah, it just gives me the heebie-jeebies when you talk about doing archives on SSDs. Why do you need, first off, sorry. So what tape is really good is holding data for a really long period of time. That's like the best thing it could do for next to nothing from a cost perspective. What a SSD is really good at is really fast random access. Like really, really fast. Why do you need that with a file that you haven't looked at in 17 years? That's all I've.
Yeah, because when you do look at it in 17 years, you want it to be instantaneous, Curtis. Come on.
Yeah.
Goodness gracious.
Instantaneous. That's absolutely true.
Sean, I know you've mentioned a couple times about sustainability, and I know, Rich, you were joking about climate change and how it's supposed to be 80 degrees in New Jersey. Could you guys talk a little bit more about what makes tape so great from a sustainability perspective versus the other technologies out there and why it really matters?
Yeah, Prasanna, it carbon impact. I don't like to use sustainability because it has so many offerings, but it is sustainability. The carbon impact of IT is huge. As we know, IT data centers consume like 3% of the world's energy all by themselves. But for tape, what it comes down to is, why is it so much better? Well, to begin with, it's fundamentally offline. The data as stored requires no energy to live for 30 years. That contributes. But then you come back to the way the operation is. Each tape drive, and let's say you've got 10, you've got 20, whatever it is only around, let's just average it out at 42 watts. So the average tape infrastructure with 50 petabytes of tape is running, give or take, right around 1.4 kilowatt hours.
Which is almost nothing.
which is almost nothing, right? That's like, 2 refrigerators running in your household. And 50 petabytes on HDD just in energy is running 97% more than that. That's just a huge amount. So you're talking about, rather than 3,800 kilowatt hours a year with tape, you're at like 28,000 kilowatt hours on HDD.
And for the HDD, you're just talking about the power, right? Not including the cooling and other aspects yet either.
Just the energy. That's before the thermal effect. So you throw the thermal effect in there and all of a sudden, by the way, tape has a charge for thermal, because one disadvantage of tape is you do have to keep the environment regulated. You can't run at 106 Fahrenheit, 40 C, right? If you do, it's just very difficult to, hard on the tape. But most environments, humans can't operate in that anyways very well. It doesn't happen. And on the other sustainability aspects come what Curtis had talked about, the longevity of it. Most people don't realize that the average tape library for an enterprise, a big, we're talking big where scale matters, lasts 16.4 years in the field, which would basically be like getting out a 1 terabyte drive from 2003 today and saying, yeah, we're good to go. We're going to put our data on it. So less migrations means less waste, less e-waste, because 98.9% of the entire tape infrastructure has a recyclable component to it. It may not be super easy, it may not be just let it rot, but it's recyclable into some sort of capability. So that just overall starts to look at data and say, well, if you're going to do a third copy, I don't need it right now. I really shouldn't need it right now. I can, number one, it's something like 68% of CEOs are now being graded on sustainability. Sustainability as in their carbon impact change. And in Europe, if you're over a certain size, you have to report your carbon impact. So it's now up into the C-suite. So your 3Ps matter: people, performance, profits, with profits being last. So they're going to have to start focusing on things like carbon impacts. And we've got lots of data that just demonstrates that at every level, from embedded to operational to end of life cycle, tape is much better for retaining that data.
Yeah. So speaking of the C-suite, and what they're concerned with, not only sustainability but bringing it back to cybersecurity. The SEC is now looking for cybersecurity disclosures, and they are holding the board members accountable for their cybersecurity preparedness, resilience, what have you. So the investors are looking at that. We'll start looking at that standardized disclosure forms, to make a judgment on the company's preparedness. And when you look at the cost of taking a petabyte and moving it offsite into an air gap compared to what companies are paying today in ransomware, it's a drop in a bucket. So it's the last line of defense for sure. There's a lot of things up front you have to do to keep the hackers out, and all those things need to be done. But it is a multifaceted approach. And I think it's a great insurance policy, to get some of that mission critical data offsite, air gapped. And the boards of these companies are going to be held personally accountable for it. So hopefully they'll start really approving the budgets to go that extra mile. The other thing is, if you want to get cyber insurance, the first thing a cyber insurance underwriter is going to want to know: are you putting your data offsite, offline? Yep. At the very first, because they're not going to give you a policy unless you're following best practices. So, I think that, final comment, putting some data on tape, getting it air gapped, is definitely a best practice today. Recommended by the government. SEC wants it. Cyber insurance companies want it. So let's do it.
Absolutely.
So for people who may not be familiar with tape or other things like that, or want to learn more, what can they do? Like, where can they go?
Yeah. I mean, Fujifilm's got a wealth of information on its own websites. Simply Google anything about tape, you'll find it. Lineartapeopen.org. IBM is a treasure trove of information. Tape Storage Council, Active Archive Alliance. There's no shortage of information. It's just people need to raise their awareness and take the effort to learn about today's modern, highly advanced tape.
Yeah, I'd say stay off YouTube for the most part. YouTubers love to go back and go, I've got this terrible thing, tape sucks. Well, if you're running one from 1972 and it's reel to reel and it fails on you, yeah, that happens on occasion. But yeah,
Wait
definitely.
A second. We've got a great video of Sean on YouTube from our summit meeting talking about sustainability of tape. So go to Fujifilm Recording Media USA YouTube and look for Sean Bremet. He's got a great number of videos.
There you go. Another one, if you have propeller heads, we're all propeller heads on this call. INSIC.org, INSIC.org, goes down to the nitty gritty of storage technologies on their site. It's a great place to get down into it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
That's great. want to thank you guys for coming on and talking. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you very much, Curtis. Thanks, Prasanna. Thanks, Sean. Pleasure to be here today.
And thank you, Sean.
Well, thank you very much. It was entertaining.
All right. And Prasanna, of course, as always, thanks for being a great co-host.
I try. It was great to meet you, Sean, and great seeing you again, Rich.
Thanks again.
And I want to thank our listeners. Of course, we would be nothing without you. That is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.